Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar, Is This Time Different? Social Movement for Racial Justice. I'm Kimberly Williams, the Director of the Center for the Humanities at Temple University. And along with my co-organizer, Judith Levine, Director of the Public Policy Lab, we thank you for joining us this afternoon for this important conversation. The past weeks have seen a renewed effort by citizens of countless towns and cities across our country to make clear that Black Lives Matter. Today's panel is the first event from the College of Liberal Arts here at Temple University. Later this month, there will be another event hosted by the Department of Africology and African American Studies. And in September, please look for details on another event hosted by the Center for Sustainable Communities. We hope that these events foster conversations and change. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Benjamin Talton. Dr. Talton is an associate professor in the Department of History at Temple University. He earned his BA in history from Howard University and his MA and PhD in history from the University of Chicago. He serves on the executive board of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, and he is an editor of the journal African Studies Review. He is an expert on African history whose research focuses on the politics and culture in modern Africa and the African diaspora. He is the author of numerous books and articles, most recently, In This Land of Plenty, Mickey Leland and Africa in American Politics, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. We are very fortunate that he is our moderator today. Again, thank you for joining us. I will now turn this webinar over to Dr. Talton. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. I want to thank you and Dean Deegs of the College of Liberal Arts here at Temple, and Judith Levine, the Director of Policy Lab here at Temple. Good afternoon from Temple University in Philadelphia, and good day wherever you might find yourself in the world. It's an honor to be a part of this conversation, and I'm pleased to be joined by my fantastic Temple University colleagues from the College of Liberal Arts. Celeste Winston, Assistant Professor in the Department of Geography and Urban Studies. Heath Fogg Davis, Professor of Political Science and Director of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Program. Ajima Olagre, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice. And rounding out our panel, we have Sean Yom, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. Welcome, I'm glad to be in conversation. It's nice to be with my Temple colleagues via Zoom. We're a very large and somewhat siloed college and university, but the upside of this situation is that we're here together. So I'm grateful to see you all. So as we get started, just in considering how we might frame this conversation beyond the recent tragic events and much of the inspiring protests and conversation that have erupted in response, I thought about W.E.B. Du Bois, in particular, Souls of Black Folk, which he published in 1903. And W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa and America and the islands of the sea." Now, as I read it, Du Bois is presenting this notion with an anticipation of what the 20th century is going to look like and what the defining issue will be. In this case, it's European imperialism, American Jim Crow segregation, and he's doing this 117 years ago. And it's important that in his brilliance, Du Bois is thinking globally. It's not just that this issue stops at the water's edge of the United States. It's a global problem in terms of imperialism as he would have seen it. But in this day, it's useful to think of it in terms of white supremacy. Now here we find ourselves again, 117 years later, to discuss the manifestations of white supremacy, and in this conversation to consider how we might move forward. And so we have this foundational question of, is this current moment different as we think about the specificities of police and white vigilante violence and killings of particularly unarmed African Americans? Is this moment different? But as we arrive here at June 18th, 2020, I want to add a little broader context to this situation. We're 3 years and 6 months, almost to the day of the start of the Trump presidency. And it's been 14 weeks since the start of the lockdown in Pennsylvania and throughout the United States. It's been 24 days since Officer Chauvin murdered George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And sadly, as we'll get to in this conversation, George Floyd did not just encounter a bad apple. It wasn't just by chance that he came across this incident. In fact, in 2019, the U.S. in the U.S., police have killed 1,098 people. In 2019, there are 1,098 people killed by the police. And according to the Mapping Police Project, approximately 30% of unarmed people killed by the police were African American. 36%, despite the fact that African Americans comprise only 13% of the US population. Put a finer note on that. African Americans are 4 times more likely than white Americans. Unarmed Black Americans are 4 times more likely than unarmed white Americans to be murdered by the police. And a little more context here as we begin our conversation, just framing it. There are approximately 2.2 million COVID-19 infections in the US with 119,000 deaths. Keeping in mind the United States has a population of 330 million people. So the US is first in the world in infections, first in the world in deaths. The top 4 countries in terms of deaths are US, Brazil, Russia, and India. And India is 4th with 367,000 infections, 12,000 deaths. And all of these countries, United States, Brazil, Russia, and India have presidents or heads of states that have denied or diminished the consequences of this pandemic. Now, again, back to the crux of our conversation, keeping in mind that the United States still lacks a coordinated plan to deal with this pandemic. According to The Guardian, the racial wound at the center of the coronavirus pandemic in the US continues to fester, with the latest data showing that African Americans died from this infection at 3 times the rate of white people. All the data bears out that these stats are not a consequence of culture, but of policy. Black people die more because of policy. Black people are incarcerated more in this country because of policy. And I contend that Black people die at the hands of police at greater rates in this country because of policy, not culture. And lastly, I think it's appropriate before we dive into the meat of our conversation to keep in mind that we are discussing the consequences of policy upon people who actually lived, right? So these are the people who have died because of police violence were real people. They're not just names in the media. They lived their lives. And I'm not going to go into everyone of the unarmed African Americans who have been killed recently by the police, and setting aside for the moment the African Americans who have been killed by white vigilantes, whether mobs or individuals, speaking just specifically about police violence toward African Americans who are unarmed, it's only right that we say a few of their names, not all of their names, but we must begin by saying a few of their names. So very quickly, I say the name of Eric Garner, who had just broken up a fight, according to witness testimony, again, going about his everyday life. Azell Ford was walking in his neighborhood. Michelle Cusseau, Tanisha Anderson, Tamir Rice was playing in a local playground. Natasha McKenna was having a schizophrenic episode when she was tased in Fairfax, Virginia, subsequently died. Walter Scott was on his way to an auto parts store. Betty Jones had called 911 to help resolve a dispute between a neighbor. Philando Castile was driving home from dinner with his girlfriend. Botham Jean was eating ice cream in his living room in Dallas. Tatiana Jefferson was babysitting her nephew at home in Fort Worth. Eric Reason was pulling into a parking spot at a local chicken and fish shop. Dominique Clayton was sleeping in her bed. Breonna Taylor was asleep in her bed. And George Floyd was leaving a grocery store. And so here we are. We have in Philadelphia, New York, Minneapolis, and Atlanta, and around the world, this audacious eruption of shared multiracial, in fact, outrage and solidarity around the fight to make Black Lives Matter. And I might add that this struggle that we are witnessing right now, this eruption, I call it this audacious eruption of shared outrage, is a flashpoint But we have to keep in mind that African Americans have been waging this fight since the 17th century in what had became the United States. It has not stopped. But we have these moments when people start to pay attention. So on that note, I want to turn first to Celeste Winston to ask, is this time different?
Great. Thank you, Ben, for that really wonderful introduction. My answer to this question, is this time different, is that, the conditions in which the current movement is taking shape are not different, right, as Ben pointed out. But the type of organizing, the type of responses that we are seeing are different, in fact. So right now we're seeing, city governments, for example, start shrinking their commitments to policing. We are seeing mainstream media sources publishing pieces where people are arguing that police abolition is not only possible, but that it's necessary in our immediate moment, right? It's not this kind of long-term political horizon. And then we're also seeing groups of everyday people who are recognizing the impacts of state violence in their lives, and they're calling for different types of investments in people-centered public safety nets, things like education, affordable quality housing, these mental health kind of services, all of these types of responses that will form an infrastructure of safety. And what I think is kind of forcing this moment to be different in a lot of ways is this ongoing crisis of anti-Black state violence that's situated within the current crisis of the pandemic. And so people are really seeing the ways in which there are different forms of violences that intersect and impact the lives of Black people in particular, but everyone. And that we need to understand and fight for ways to rethink public safety beyond policing, so that we can all live better lives. And that recognition, isn't new for everyone. It's new for some people, but that recognition is the legacy of an ongoing movement of police and prison abolition that's been taking shape for centuries.
Thank you. So we have a lot that we could unpack. This idea of police abolition, people-centered policies, rethinking what public safety looks like and means to everyday people. So we could unpack a lot of that. Before we do, though, let's turn to Heath, to you, just to think about, in some broad strokes, your thoughts on how this moment and movement are different.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in my mind about this, and I appreciate both Celeste's words and Ben's as well. And I also want to thank the organizers for this important conversation. I agree with a lot of what Celeste just said, and I would maybe also add to that to say that I think the moment can be different if we want it to be different, and not only want it to be different, but put action behind it. And I'm old enough to remember vividly Rodney King and sort of decades of police violence against Black bodies. I think what's sort of my main concern is that in our moment of mourning and grieving over folks like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, is that our tolerance for Black pain just ends up getting raised. I think that that's one thing about this country that is very real, is that there's a very high tolerance among white people in particular for seeing Black pain and suffering. And so we've seen that before. The cynic in me worries that we have just sort of raised the bar on that tolerance for, and then we kind of go on with business as usual. But we don't have to do that. And I think that Black Lives Matter offers a different kind of social movement sort of template. It's non-hierarchical. It doesn't follow traditional social movement organization. It centers marginalized people within the Black community. So Black, queer, and trans and gender non-conforming folks, and anyone who's been marginalized. And I think also that one of the things that I find really inspirational about this particular movement is that it's radical and it's also very pragmatic, so that there is like a larger picture about sort of, dealing with institutional racism, but also not losing sight of the things that we can do also all around us. And we're seeing the impact of that in lots of different ways. Everything from, dictionary definitions of racism changing to, Aunt Jemima pancakes going away as they should have a long time ago, and various things. So I think there's a lot going on there. It gives me hope, but we have to pay attention to understand kind of what Black Lives Matter is asking us to do. And sort of, I worry that once we get through this period of mourning that we lose our attention. And just to tack onto that one thing, I was glad to hear, Ben talk about men and women across sexuality and trans status who have lost their lives at the hands of the police. And I think that's very important. So intersectionality is at the forefront of Black Lives Matter. Keeping that in mind, the mainstream media, there's a lot that's different. They're starting to talk about systemic racism and use the term intersectionality and talk about institutional racism. But what's not different is that there's a very limiting frame still for understanding this. And so the lives of Black women, for example, have not gotten the same kind of attention. And if you go back to Black Lives Matter and what they're all about, it is not about putting one segment of the Black community ahead of the rest.
No, thank you for that, Heath. I think it's very important that there's a number of points like Celeste that you raised. I was a part of a march where we were very deliberate about shouting out Breonna Taylor because it seemed like she was getting lost in the events around George Floyd. And we also have to keep in mind the trans women who have been gone missing or killed by police. And these terms, intersectionality and systematic racism, we need to spend some time and unpack these. We're at a moment we're able to have a conversation that moves away from this idea that racism is about treating people badly or saying bad things to people, that there's a broader system involved. So I hope at some point later on, we can come back and begin to define these terms for our audience. But I want to go back before I move on to this question of, is this different with Ajima? Just to stay with you for a second, Heath. And you describe Black Lives Matter as a non-hierarchical organization and movement. If you could just spend a few moments digging a little deeper in terms of what are the benefits of that? You described it as a plus. Some people might say there's a deficit because there's no one up front and center defining what the narrative is, what are the goals are, what are the next steps. But you see this as a plus for the movement.
I do. And I think that, as somebody who has been teaching, African-American political thought at Temple for a number of years, and we've talked about these ideas, I think, there's a kind of like a narrow form of Black nationalism that they're fighting against, and also a Black liberalism, which has sort of put at the center legislative gains. And you can think back to the 50s and 60s. I see, Black Lives Matter is sort of forging a pathway between those two approaches. And I think, like I said before, at once it's radical and it wants to take on the system. And for a long time, I think a lot of people felt like the system couldn't change. And what I think is beautiful about Black Lives Matter is that they are pushing for that change. They're not naive about that this is going to be easy or that it will ever happen in its totality, but also in sort of moving ahead with that agenda, paying attention to all sorts of changes that are happening. And we mentioned a few before. These are really things that I never thought would happen in my lifetime, actually. I was sort of resigned to see Aunt Jemima that, go through different hairstyles over the years and attempts to sort of reform that. And now that it's going away, that seems like, of course, we should have done that a long time ago. But those are the sorts of various sort of venues where this, the attention that's being drawn to this is really important. And the other thing that I would point out too, as you said, is, about policy in the beginning, and I agree with that. But it's not just about the laws on the books, it's like the law in action, and it's about the enforcement of what we encode in the law, where it's enforced, when it's enforced. And there are a lot of opportunities here to address that. And so I hope, I'm thinking about even higher education as a system and Temple as an organization. And I'm sure a lot of the panelists and other people are thinking about that too. I know that I've had students, former students, reach out to me and tell me about the things that they're doing to reform how their high schools did things, for example. I mean, it's pretty incredible. So I think it's like this two-tier thing, like keeping the eye on this bigger picture. You could say that's overwhelming and it can't change, so do nothing. But that's not what Black Lives Matter says. Even if it can't change in its totality, we can do a lot along the way, and very quickly. Actually, you've seen like CEOs act pretty quickly, and city councils as well.
And we've seen the short-term and long-term proposals, and the language we're using is slightly different, which I'll come back to. Aunt Jemima, the bottle of syrup being changed is important, but then we also have some more concrete things to deal with. Ajima, if this is not something different, then we'll be here again, no? And we have to think about the ways in which, and Heath touched on this a bit, but the ways in which the current debates and proposals really are something different, because if they're not different, how can we move forward?
Yes, first, thank you to the director of the Public Policy Lab and chat for organizing this important event, and for my co-panelists for joining us in this important conversation. Before I get to your question, Ben, I just want to quickly position myself in a couple ways as someone who has direct and vicarious experiences with the criminal justice system that are both positive and negative, and reflect themes such as victimization, including police brutality and family fragmentation, to name a few. And my hope here today in this discussion is not so to provide answers, but to provide perspective. And to your question about this time not being something different, I respect and appreciate the variation that Celeste and Heath have pointed out in the ways in which this time is different. But for me, it's an emphatic no, in the sense that until we see structural change, sort of solutions-focused action and a bias towards action, we will, if not entirely repeat the current moments, but we'll have remnants of it where we shouldn't. Key to your point about Du Bois, presciently calling out that the problem of the color of the 20th century is the problem of the the problem of the color line is going to be the problem of the 20th century, and here we are 20 years into 21st. And so for me, it's more of a question of what is the 80-year master plan that's a bias towards action. And with respect to protests, the debates and proposals that are coming out, if I may, I'd like to sort of impose a linear framework on those three items, where the protests are doing what they're designed to do and always should do, which is awaken our consciousness to something that's fundamentally wrong in our country. And that should then inform debates, right, that should draw upon our work as academics, we people in the field who are working hard to bring in sort of knowledge from communities and sort of people in think tanks across the board, a diversity of opinions, including those opinions that are critical. And that should then drive and inform actual proposals that can lean on frameworks that are yielding towards problem solving, so that we literally have actionable items at the end of the day that we can all work towards doing something different, so that we understand that the work we're doing today in the next decade, again, 80 years from now, there is something different. And if we're going to have another public outcry, the hope is that it's not about the continual strive for racial equity and racial justice in this country.
No, that's a wonderful explanation of the differences between proposals and cultural change. And it's important to keep in mind, and Heath nicely laid out the importance of the structures of protest, but we also have to remember that while there are protests in the street, and it's beautiful to see, there are many just right down the street from where I live, and they're multiracial, which is powerful, something I had not seen on this issue in my lifetime at this scale. But there are also organizations that are active in terms of lawsuits, in terms of outreach. There's legislation being proposed, so we can't just rely on protest, right? It's a multi-front attack on white supremacy. It's not just the protest alone, as important as that is. And then these are points, again, that we'll have to return to in the conversation. But Sean, let me tweak the question a little bit for you, because you are a scholar who focuses on Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and you are an expert in dictatorships and authoritarianism. And you're a good person to offer insight into where you see this country headed, even with the protests and the current debates, but even beyond that. I'm reminded of a colleague of mine when I taught at Hofstra University many years ago, who said, and this is during the invasion of the Iraq War, invasion of Iraq after 9/11, he said, you people, meaning Americans, don't know what authoritarianism is, so therefore you will not recognize when you live under authoritarianism. So can you speak on that a little bit? Just give us some insight into where you see, what does this foreshadow in your eyes, the protests and then the government responses to it? Oh, maybe add not just the government, but the media as well, the way the media has responded to it.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the other panelists for all of us for putting together this event, which I hope will be useful for our students and fellow faculty and the broader Temple community. So I am a political scientist, and I study comparative politics, and so that means I spend almost all of my time looking at things like political opposition, authoritarian abuses, repression, coercion, and institutions in states like Syria and Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Morocco. And what strikes me the most about the current moment we're living in, if I can add my comparative perspective, not just as a person of color, but also as someone who spends most of his time as an American person of color in another region where most people also don't look like me, what strikes me is that the response of the Trump administration and many local political figures in urban areas around the country is strikingly Middle Eastern in its authoritarian bent. And in fact, I would say, if we want to add some comparative leverage to this discussion, if you want to understand the tone-deaf nature of the Trump administration's responses to Black Lives Matter, then study Syria or Saudi Arabia or Iran or Turkey. Look to countries where autocratic regimes that lack electoral legitimacy also face radical calls from below to change their political institutions. And what we've seen many government figures at the federal, state, and local level do in response to Black Lives Matter is a classic trick from the dictatorship's playbook, which is to delegitimize the protesters by naming them and shaming them. So here are a few ways that, from my perspective as a political analyst, I've seen different political figures, starting at the federal level with the Trump administration, what they've done to Black Lives Matter that, again, to me, is strikingly similar to many countries in the Arab world. So one is you draw a false dichotomy between good protesters and bad protesters. Good protesters are peaceful, they're meek, they return home after a few hours, right? Bad protesters are loud, they're militant, they disobey authority, right? Second, frame the protests as being orchestrated by shadowy conspiracies led by scary sounding figures like Antifa or George Soros. And the goal here is to make the protests seem alien to the nation and therefore easier to ignore for bystanders. And this is a tried and true trick in much of the Arab world. And it seems, for me, it was really troubling to see some of the conservative media and many figures at the federal level traffic in the conspiracy theories as well. So a third authoritarian tactic is to accuse of protesters of harboring criminality, criminalize the protests, argue that the protesters are inviting criminal elements in. So think about the vocabulary used by some conservative figures to describe Black Lives Matter and some of the unfortunate externalities of some of the protests. The words like vandals, thugs, outlaws, militants, extremists, they're all being used to describe everyone protesting as if they were a monolithic entity. And for those of us who study other regions, I mean, we know these words because these are words that in other languages are used classically against human rights activists to legitimize them and to argue that they have no place in civil, peaceful discourse. And I think the final tactic I see that both the media and the Trump administration in particular has done and it continues to do is maintain the mantra of law and order. I mean, I forget the number of times I've heard our president say this phrase, law and order first, and you insinuate that protesters are unleashing chaos, right? That beyond them is the flood, and they must be held back, right? So if you think about the executive order that our president signed a few days ago pledging police reforms, even that order and the hullabaloo around it, right, was permeated with this rhetoric that we support police reforms, but not at the cost of law and order. And the insinuation that all dictators give, right, and this is some of the rhetoric coming from American political figures, which again troubles me, is that protests are okay if they follow the rules set by the government, if they retreat in the face of law and order. So the question that I pose as a comparative political scientist is, what if law and order is the problem itself? What if the law kills and order is code for systemic racial inequality and white supremacy? So for me, in my view, that's what the current moment in America is all about. It's about a grassroots struggle for greater democracy and fundamentally human rights against different levels of government that I see troublingly dip into the authoritarian playbook to delegitimize protests and to argue that the best way to solve this problem is by looking beyond it rather than resolving it.
It makes me think of during the apartheid era in South Africa, where anything that was against apartheid or the apartheid state was labeled as communist, even though communists had some influence, but not a great deal of influence. Even in this country, you drew some wonderful examples from beyond the seas, but African Americans were labeled communist as well, or un-American for opposing the racial regime in this country. I want to remind our viewers and listeners that we have, you could pose some questions via the Q&A function on Zoom at the bottom. We'll be turning to some questions in just a few minutes. We are also using the handle TU Liberal Arts on Twitter with the hashtag Is This Something Different? Hashtag Is This Something Different? I know that's a lot of letters using up for your characters, but I think that speaks directly to what we are covering here today. So again, that's the handle at TU Liberal Arts on Twitter. Sean, can I just follow up? I'm thinking about Michel Rolfe-Triot, who in his wonderful book, Silencing the Past, reminds us that most Americans don't learn history from professional historians, that they get their history from the people around them, from the news media, from movies. I might add now today, to stress that to today, most Americans get their political information from social media. You addressed nicely, you framed nicely the US government compared to some governments in North Africa and the Middle East. What about the media as a source of information? In your research and just in viewing the current moment, what have you seen in terms of pattern in the news media that departs from or aligns with what you've seen with the US government and in terms of rhetoric?
Right. Well, so to quickly answer the question, I would say we are seeing right now some spaces for critical interrogation and revisitations of racial inequality and racial injustice in some of the mainstream media. And I think my colleague Heath even mentioned that as a kind of potentially heartening fact. And I would agree. I think the thing that troubles me the most is, I mean, it took them long enough, right? So if you look at the start of the initial wave of protests in Philadelphia, for instance, a few weeks ago, what shocked me the most, and I haven't lived in the city as long as a number of other of our listeners and perhaps some of you. I've been here for a decade, so I don't know the local media landscape that well. But if I could switch between CNN and Fox News and say, Action 6 ABC and the local NBC and CBS affiliates, for the first week of protests, what shocked me is how uniformly shallow coverage was of the contentious mobilization and local politics of the protests here in Philadelphia. There was this national narrative that began forming after the first and second wave of protests led to this unfortunate externality of looting and violence in some cities, that the protests were all part of a uniform, monolithic, hierarchical organization, and that it had gotten out of control. And we are seeing that violence now in terms of, attacks on the Apple store and property damage and some violence against the police and police using violence against protesters, and everything fed into the rhetoric of chaos. I remember watching the local news media for a solid week And like the only reporting I saw for the first 4 or 5 days was the same recycled helicopter footage of the same neighborhoods where looting was taking place, with voiceovers from reporters who were giving commentary from home or their studios, right? They were not talking to organizers, and there were hundreds of organizers from several dozen organizations that cross-cut in their in mobilizing the protests in Philadelphia. They didn't peruse the Reddit threads in which people were talking about ideas. They didn't look at Facebook groups. They didn't trace online how different ideas were being debated. They didn't see the micro politics of protests in Philadelphia about why, for instance, critical questions like why was it that after the first day, every successive protest got bigger in Philadelphia, but it also got wider? Right. And there's an important racial dynamic to that. No one asked that question, I think, in the local news media. And again, as a Philadelphian resident, that surprises me, because this city does have a heritage of very critical and at times hard-hitting investigative journalism. And it just shocks me that basically it took a few weeks for the media to catch up to the narrative, the real narrative playing out, which is that there is a veil you have to pierce that uncovers much of what we see on the street and in our institutions. And it just took them so long to pierce it. And again, I'm accustomed to seeing this in a place like Egypt or Jordan. It's troubling for me to see this in my own backyard.
It was amazing. And I watched Ajima's cat walk back and forth, which is adding a little levity to it. It took about 2 days for the media to stop calling these Black protests and for saying Black people are destroying property. In fact, these were majority white protests, and much of the property was being done, damage was being done by white infiltrators. But Celeste, I want to turn to you for a response.
Yes, yeah. So I appreciate the comparisons that you've drawn, Sean, between the United States case and the Middle East. But I do want to point out that there is this deeply long history of kind of a mainstream or popular response to Black resistance in this country that I think we can turn to understand what's happening today. So, if we even go back to the plantation, there was this kind of externalizing of Black revolt, calling people who are enslaved, who are resisting, outside agitators, that their imperatives to be free were, funneled and fostered by outside agitators. And we see that same type of language playing out in the media today, where people are saying, it's not the protesters who are looting, who are burning police cars, but rather it's these outside agitators. And I think that it's also a very American kind of rhetoric. And what it does is that it enables us to distance ourselves from the reality that looting and rioting are are part of the process of getting policies made that change our reality and that build worlds that are more free. And it also helps us to kind of shield ourselves from the reality that looting, for example, really helps us to understand the relationship between police power and white property and Black unfreedom that these protests are really seeking to dismantle.
And there is so much concern with property as opposed to Black lives in the way that we, as Sean nicely puts. Let's stay with you for a moment, Celeste, because I want to drill down on some of the specifics. You use the term police abolition, where what has been most commonly invoked is defunding the police. And the way you phrase it reminds me of Angela Davis, even in the 1990s, was talking about abolish prisons in the prison industrial complex. And famously in her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? I think that's from around 2003. Of course, in the 90s, people put Angela Davis, when she's saying abolish the police and mass incarceration is an extension of white supremacy, they put her in the lunatic fringe of the left. It was as a non-starter. And now suddenly, well, not suddenly, but over the course of years, with her tenacity and people organizing around it, white supremacy has not only become part of our parlance, particularly in academia, and among activists, but also we're rethinking mass incarceration. Now, you're using the term abolish the police. Again, in distinction, I believe, to defunding the police. Can you get into the specifics of the two, and then tell us what would abolishing the police actually look like? What are the steps?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so the call to defund police is animating this kind of current kind of conjuncture. But it's part of this longer history of abolition. And people like Angela Davis, people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, people like Mariame Kaba have been at the helm of these conversations. And yeah, I think the New York Times actually did a profile of Ruth Wilson Gilmore last year. And so I think, there's already been this kind of widening reception around the ideas of abolition. And so I use abolition to really acknowledge that long legacy. But defund the police means to eliminate police budgets, to reduce them until those budgets are zero and until we have no police. And there's actually been a lot of confusion around the fact that defund the police, in fact, means what it says. And I've seen a number of think pieces being published where the writers are trying to reassure people that when activists are calling for defunding the police, they don't mean that. And they argue that it's just about reducing the budgets and reducing kind of our priorities when it comes to policing, but not getting to the point of eliminating police. And so I think what that kind of confusion highlights is that defunding the police has got to just be understood as an entry point, right? And abolition starts at that entry point. It starts with this idea that we've got to understand safety beyond policing. We need to defund police. We need to disband police departments. But we also need to do the next step, which is doing the type of world building that includes investing in real public safety nets like affordable quality housing and education and healthcare, and as well as just this kind of broader infrastructure of care and safety that can eventually do what Mariame Kaba, who's an abolitionist, has said, which is to make police obsolete. So again, defunding the police is a good entry point, but it's not abolition, and we need to understand this larger movement of abolition that's really centered around, not just eliminating police, but replacing police and building worlds that, go beyond the type of imagination that reforms to policing can give us.
That's perfect. I'm also thinking of activists who recently have been raising the point that police actually do very little policing of crime and very little solving of crime. So this fear that if there is no police as it's currently situated, we're going to have this outbreak of crime everywhere. But in fact, police do very little policing of crime, though it depends on the community, of course. There's over-policing and hyper-policing in particular communities. Najima, let me turn to you, though, because your research is centered on policing. Can you tell us just a little bit, keeping in mind Celeste's points, her wonderful articulation of these distinctions between defunding as an entry point and abolition as that's the end goal, and thinking anew about what our communities look like, really what it means to be a citizen, right? Mm-hmm. And the relationship citizenship in the state looks like. But tell us a little bit about your research and what it tells you about just policing research in general, how it's talked about and how we should understand it.
Yes, absolutely. So I appreciate Celeste's clarification about those terms, because I think often when they're put out there in the public, they remain ambiguous and actually helps contribute to uninformed debates, which then, as I talked about earlier, can then, actually lead to uninformed proposals. That isn't reflective of a lot of literature and evidence base that talks about the ways in which we can impose problem-solving frameworks and strategies for police to do what they were meant to do in this country, was be guardians of our 14th Amendment rights. And so with respect to my research right now, two particular projects I'm focused on, and the latter aspect I'll talk about sort of reinforces Celeste's point about essentially reimagining the police and their role, particularly for African Americans. But right now I'm focusing on police decision-making and discretion, really trying to unpack that black box. Why and how, what does that mean? Trying to understand the problem itself separating myself outside of it and sort of any sort of personal and professional sort of reactions I have to sort of the failure of police and therefore the failure of our state as well to sort of properly hold police accountable, where where instances of extrajudicial killings and where police are not using force as a last resort and as a measured tool. So this project is more so looking to the literature, policing scholars to date, and focusing specifically and narrowly on those studies that actually either interview or observe police officers in their actions, trying to systematically understand in what sense can we draw some conclusions about the context in which police officers are making these decisions. If we begin to understand that context and begin to understand language that's used around describing police decision making, which typically is about split-second decisions, we can perhaps move closer to what an emeritus professor, Samuel Walker at University of Nebraska, Omaha, their School of Criminality and Criminal Justice talks about, sort of pushing us towards more tactical-based decision-making, where critical thinking and thinking itself become the very tools where capacity to use, where using force is about a capacity to use it and is not sort of the knee-jerk reaction, right? And so decisions that rely on, well, split-second decisions because of shifting contexts and situations is not even a minimum or a standard, right? It's more so about what tools are you using to think about the situation, the context you're in, to lead to a healthy outcome that doesn't perpetuate, what we are experiencing right now. The other aspect of my research that sort of highlights Celeste's point about essentially reimagining police and public safety, and I would argue also reconstituting those very departments, or in some cases, specific units within police departments, as New York City Police has just done with their plainclothes unit, is taking into account the voices that have often been ignored in our literature, but also in public debates, and especially in the media, sort of Sean just sort of pointed out, is how African Americans themselves feel about police. And sort of the nuanced perspective is that, and I will chat once you transition to the next panelist, a couple of studies that talk about this, is that African Americans hold a very complex, contradictory view of police, in that there's a very high standard that we want the police to do what they're supposed to do, right? Just don't kill us, right? Don't repeat essentially the relics of slave patrol policing, which is to reinforce racial oppression, because we still need to have our communities protected. Particularly, we have communities that are not in a position, that don't have the resources because of structural disadvantage, decades of that can even begin to think about how do we in ourselves enact public safety, which goes back to Celeste's point about we need these different preventative structural reforms. Because in a lot of ways, the police are dealing with the problems of the failure of our social structure system. At the end of the day, though, they are primarily responsible for acting above the bar. So there's sort of two veins there, in the sense that African Americans have very high expectations. And I think and these expectations have not been met. And I think that's critically important, particularly as we think about how, in particular, municipal police departments have diversified. And you have Black, Latinx, Asian, and even indigenous police officers who are in these departments now and have their own stories to share about how they have to walk this fine line between public safety and upholding 14th Amendment rights, and having to work within a system in a lot of ways that does need to be abolished and reconstituted in ways that is reflective of our democratic principles.
I'm gonna put my pushback hat on in just a second and offer an alternative view by way of devil's advocate. But I want to remind people the Q&A is still open in there. We have some nice questions coming in. I'm going to turn to them in just a second. But and I'm glad Ajim, I'm glad you brought up the 14th Amendment. I think it's perhaps one of the most important amendments, and we don't think about we take the 14th for granted, but it's very, very, I think it really is what makes the United States unique. But you said the prevalent view among African Americans is that they just want the police to do what they're supposed to do. They hold police to a high standard. What if I were to say the police are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is why even when we have Latinx or African Americans in the police force, we still have police brutality, we still have police violence, we still have the killing of unarmed African Americans by the police, because it was set up to police Black bodies as a mechanism of control.
I love that question. And I just want to caveat a little bit. I'm not prepared to say that empirically a majority of African Americans feel this way, because of the studies that I'm drawing from criminologists Rod Brunson and Brian Wade, and a study by authors by the name of Carr Napolitano, and I'm forgetting the scholar's last name, but as I mentioned, I will make sure I put this in the chat box for our viewers to check out. These have mostly been qualitative studies that have allowed us to understand the depth of this phenomenon among African-American public opinion. But to your question, for me, the solution in terms of, it's a structural problem is reinforced by that. So the solution, the issue is both inclusive and exclusive of police. In terms of inclusion with police, at the end of the day, they are responsible for being held accountable to a standard of excellence and are challenged to be the best versions of ourselves, because that's a position, that's an oath that they swore to take. And they have to fill that fundamental principle of equal protection under the law. But I think the persistence of police violence beyond the diversification of police ranks is fueled by too much passion and not enough perspective. And in the interest of being above the bar, always, it's a matter of police acknowledging and recognizing that is their fundamental challenge and that's their fundamental responsibility. And if those are responsibilities and challenges that are too much, then it's a question of, is this the appropriate line of work for you? And going back to Celeste's point, where we have to reconsider ways in which we have to restructure these very institutions. And there's examples of that happen with the Camden County Police Department, and even just a parallel with school systems. DC Public Schools some time ago fired all their teachers and rehired them. So there's examples in which we can do that. But at the same time, I don't think we can fail to ignore or dissect the interlocking institutions and the structural failures that, give rise to the very question of whether what we're talking about right now is this time different. And for me, it spurns deeper reflection and thinking about the broader constitutional IOU of racial justice and equity. And it concerns quality of governance, political participation, the various sort of state of the social institutions that are supposed to play a role in the sense that police are literally policing, no matter our skin tone. Because at the end of the day, we're still encountering essentially the effects of, in my opinion, those broader social structural failures, particularly when communities need them right now more than ever. And so what we have done is we've defaulted to police to essentially do that work, where they are literally policing. And they're literally having sort of in this case, the rudimentary tools that they have to do that. And so there's some efforts now to sort of develop co-response teams where you have social workers going with police to sort of try to address the problem of encountering individuals with mental health or co-occurring disorders. But for me, that's sort of not enough, because the problem of sort of locating the criminal justice system, and specifically the police, as the primary and the predominant site of interventions for the failures of our social structures, and executing those tasks, you end up sort of risking and reaping and perpetuating harm and trauma, particularly for Black and Brown people in this country. And you're reminding them that we are resorting to institutions and tools that will not safeguard fair and equal protection. And it becomes sort of, that notion itself becomes specious at best. For me, it's like, we shouldn't have to involve the police. They are literally emergency responders. So we need to treat them and respond to them in that way as emergency responders. And this is the last thing I'll say in the context of this, which is really an indictment on society, is that the next question we have to go to is, what is the state of our communities? Are they ready? Are they prepared? Do they themselves have the tools? And that's sort of another feature of my research, is going in that direction. It's not just about shifting responsibilities, which we do need to do, but then because certain entities in our society, in this case communities, have been disenfranchised, ignored for so long, there has become a norm. And that norm is embedded literally in our behaviors and our actions, to the point where you have things where I think of James Foreman's work, we're locking up our own.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Ajima. That was very, very well put. I appreciate that response. I'm looking at Celeste. I know she has some things to add, but she wants to be polite. So as she formulates her thoughts, which I know she has, I want to go back to Heath's point and get some definitions. From the outset, you talked about intersectionality. And I'm thinking about the protests in Ferguson when Black Lives Matter really erupted onto the global stage. And there was a lot of attention paid to the fact that this organization was founded by Black queer women. And Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality had been around for a while, but it gained currency in the movement and among academics. So I'm wondering if you feel that we are moving on the momentum that was gained in that moment. Is it still with us? Are you seeing the benefits of that conversation in ways that, the ways it looked in Ferguson, are we seeing remnants of that now?
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot there. I think, it's been really interesting to see. I mean, I've been teaching these concepts, and I know a lot of other people have for decades now. And Kimberly Crenshaw was, one of the founding scholar activists with the critical race theory movement out of law schools, and she's still at it. And so I would encourage people to check out her think tank at Columbia University, and check it out there. The Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy, to check that out. Yeah, there were remnants of that. I wondered if I could just talk a little bit. There's something that's been bothering me about this, and just listening to everything, and it kind of gets back to Ajima's point. We haven't really talked about whiteness in this session, and I think, one of the best-selling books right now is about white fragility, and this concept that whites have a difficult time hearing critical feedback, even if it's intended to be constructive. That's a real kind of sticking point. The defensiveness that goes along with a lot of white liberalism is a huge problem, and it's a huge impediment to moving forward in terms of any kind of policy. I mean, Derek Bell talked about an interest convergence theory, that only when whites' see their interests as converging with those of African Americans are they going to be sign on to policy changes. So that's been a huge thing that has sort of been in my mind in thinking about all of this, about why must the race problem always be sort of shouldered by Black people themselves, ourselves, and where are our white colleagues doing the labor of figuring out what are the personal things that you're willing to give up? I think a systemic racism benefits whites and others. So what are you willing to give up? And that's a huge question about like sacrifice. And that's, we talked about some of these, like the corporate moves and different things that are happening are in a sense easy things to do because now public opinion is sort of on the side of that. But what about when it comes to, quote unquote, diversifying, boardrooms and power structures where most of us are the, only one or two people in our departments who are African American. I mean, like the bigger projects where you're thinking in terms of like what the goals are, like what would it mean to have a different kind of structure in academia that looked radically different, and why? And I think those proposals and that thinking has to start to come from our white allies. So like the defensiveness about why you might have chosen to live where you live, is an impediment to thinking about like the problem solving. And I think that's a conversation that we have to have about, do you really want things to be different? But because that will mean that you will have to give up something. And so what is it that you're willing to give up?
So I'm unmuting there. I'm reminded that Ta-Nehisi Coates says, the only solution for the end of white supremacy is to end white supremacy, right? White people have to give up this idea of whiteness. It move beyond what it means. We want to close out with some specifics in terms of pedagogy to end the conversation. But in the meantime, let's turn to some of these great questions that we have here. If you don't mind, I haven't forgot about you, Celeste. You still need to respond to what Ajima said. But we have a Gus student and a criminal justice student at Temple who What do you think of the simultaneous calls for the arrests of these officers, but also the abolishment of the prison industrial complex? And what do you consider appropriate actions in a world with or without the police, or with or without unjust criminal justice system? I'll leave that open to whoever wants to take it. There's this, there's a seeming contradiction in wanting these police officers to go to jail and then ultimately to prison, but we want to abolish these prisons. So there's a police action and there's a carceral action. Any of you want to jump in and respond to this, student?
Do you mind repeating the question one more time?
What do you, I'll take the first part because I did some
Okay.
editorializing in the end, which might have confused things a little bit. But what do you think of the simultaneous calls for the arrests of these officers, but also the abolishment of the prison industrial complex? What do you think are the appropriate actions?
Oh, go ahead, Celeste. No, I want to leave. I'll let you.
Okay. So I understand, people's calls for wanting police officers who kill to be charged and imprisoned. But I think that from an abolitionist standpoint, we've got to try to imagine justice beyond the flawed systems that have never given us justice. And so, might we imagine, real justice looking like those police officers being fired, police forces being shrunk, non-reformist reforms which can shrink police, our investments in policing, and allow us to foster conditions that will reduce that violence in the first place. And so I think, again, it makes sense that people call for these responses to police, and it's a symptom of the limited options of justice that we have in our current order. But it is possible to be on the side of abolition and try to imagine justice in a really different way. And I'll stop there so another person can respond if you want, Ajima, too.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with what Celeste says. That I think the simultaneous call is simultaneously achievable. I think we have to remember that the criminal justice system is a series of decision points, of processes, and police are at that front end of that system that feels literally this billion-dollar industry. And so when you're talking about the prison industrial complex, you have to talk about the different phases of the system that should probably be undergoing some sort of reconstitution or reformations. And you do see a lot of that, particularly in our literature in this current era in which we're trying to infuse evidence-based policy and evidence-based and research to produce better outcomes. And as I mentioned earlier, that's complicating when you're making the criminal justice system as the predominant site of these kind of interventions. With respect to the calls for arrest, I think that's just straight up accountability. Like, if you have extrajudicial killings that are definitely against departmental policy, that are ruled homicides, that goes against the Constitution, it is accountability that needs to be taken. And arrest is one of those forms of accountability. I think it's essentially just crudely saying that, yes, police officers, the very individuals who are supposed to protect us from crime and prevent crime and solve crime, are also capable of committing crimes. And so when that does happen, we need to hold them accountable. And then, just pivoting back to this idea of the prison industrial complex, one thing I want to sort of hone in on is that, the criminal justice system is the largest mental health provider. Are we comfortable with that? And if we're not, then in order to sort of, disband and, reset the system for what it was designed to do, ultimately, which was to rehabilitate and incapacitate people. And there's ways we can do that holistically. Then yes, and again, to Celeste's point, we have to start working and being action-based in other ways so that these other institutions that can play a more humanistic role and role that's more consistent with our prevailing values need to begin to do that work. The partnership, right? So if we're talking about defunding and divesting, then money needs to go in that direction.
Yeah, I was told to mute and I keep forgetting to unmute. All right. Anyone want to chime in? I have a question I want to point towards Sean. If you don't The question focuses on another key collective actor that has gained incredible power and legitimacy through Trump's rhetoric and actions. How do you see or understand the role of armed white militia actions? They show up in the actions against pandemic lockdowns as rallies, as allies to police. They attack protesters and engage in violence that often gets attributed to the protests. Are we headed to another civil war? And I'm thinking just not necessarily to draw comparisons to other places. And of course, the Arab Spring looms large in my thinking. But the question is, does this look like we're headed towards some civil war?
Wow. Okay, that's a very fateful question with a sense of unironic foreboding. I think, in all seriousness, from a comparative perspective, and looking at the Middle East and looking at the contemporary situation of human rights in America, because as someone who kind of constantly, my mind constantly wants to compare different sets of democracies and authoritarianism, the way I look at Black Lives Matter and the contemporary episode for racial justice, which is one of many episodes for racial justice in America, is that it is another example of the universal struggle for human rights. Right? Black Lives Matter is fundamentally a human rights movement because the human rights demanded by people of color in America are not remarkably different than the human rights demanded by oppressed peoples all over the world. The right not to be, for instance, arbitrarily detained, harmed, or killed because your skin color is darker, right? I think that strikes most people as a fundamentally human right, as well as a problematic claim in the context of American politics. In terms of civil war, I will say that I think what we're seeing now in American politics is increasing political polarization and the extreme distancing between different preference points on the political spectrum. And I think that the entry of counter-protesters is part of that. If you look at what successful authoritarian regimes do when they face mass movements in places like China, for instance, which is a good example, but Egypt and Jordan are good examples as well, is that either explicitly or complicitly, authoritarian regimes will outsource their repression to third parties. Oftentimes that outsourcing are done by so-called private militias, which is the word we prefer to use in America. In Arabic, in Egypt and Jordan, we call them the Baltaghiya, right, who are basically private citizens with some peripheral contact with the state, who are inspired by state media, and sometimes they are explicitly employed by agents of the state, but their job is to contain human rights activists and civic protesters and to make it seem like this is not a battle between protesters for human rights and the state. This is a battle between citizens, right? Which kind of muddies the water. I think that's one element in contemporary America that we should be aware of, that we're not exceptional in having that dynamic. We see this in many other countries around the world. I think the other danger I will pose, and I think this builds on Ajima and Celeste Heath's own expert interventions, is about accountability and what we do when we've reached a point where a non-trivial proportion of the American population, right, believes that policing institutions are systemically flawed and generate human rights violations. Right? And the response to that, right? There are two responses that I've heard kind of echo around the national discursive arena. One is that, well, we must hold the police accountable, right? There's very few people will resist that publicly, that if officers are murdering other people, then you hold those officers accountable. That's the easy way out, I think. I think we can all agree that's the easy way out. It's sort of like when you hear pundits on Fox News say, well, of course the officers who murdered George Floyd should be prosecuted. The only question is if it's murder 1, 2, or 3, right? They're not talking about the policing institutions that generated those practices. They're talking about, well, we can selectively call out and moral outrage this one murder without talking about the underlying institutions. If we're going to avoid, I think, worsening political conflict, there has to be dialogue about what we do with those institutions that may result in systematic violations of human rights. And I think the easy answer just to hold Ben, when you started this conversation, you used the metaphor bad apples to hold the bad apples accountable. I think that kind of, I think that's the first step, obviously. But what worries me is that too many Americans just want to stop there, right? And that if you talk to human rights activists in other countries who have been tortured and arrested and detained, right? And you told them, what if the government said, we're sorry for the person who tortured you in China, he was a bad apple, right? No one would accept that. We would say, no, there is a systemic problem here of voices being marginalized and suppressed. What if that was the case in America? Right. I want to close this by I just remembered something. So Chris Rock has this really biting stand-up set from a few years ago, which is making the rounds again, in which he kind of just takes this bad apple accountability claim to task, in which people, when they hear about another Black life murder, they'll say, well, hold the people accountable, but don't touch the policing institutions. Most police officers are good. And Chris Rock says, there are some occupations where like everyone just has to be good, right? So the analogy he gives is, right, American Airlines can say, most of our pilots like to land. It's not our fault some of them like to crash into mountains, right? And put yourself empathically, if there are any kind of cynics in the audience in that situation. Imagine if someone you love dearly, tragically died in a plane crash, and American Airlines says, we're sorry. We're sorry for those bad apples among our pilot pool, but most of them are good. Fly with us again, right? We would never accept that. Our instinct wouldn't be to shrug our shoulders and say we'll defend, American Airlines and pilots, even though we know that a scary proportion of them like to kill people. We'd question how pilots are recruited. We'd question their training standards. We would question how much they're getting paid. We'd question corruption in the industry. We'd interrogate the entire structure that resulted in that loss of life. We would dig and we would dig and we would dig, and we wouldn't stop until we buried that airline for taking the life of someone we loved. And we'd be insulted if anyone told us to stop, because most pilots like to land. Right. And I think that's the same problem with policing. And for us to avoid worsening political polarization, I think there has to be some recognition among a plurality of Americans that it's not just about a few bad apples. We have to, I think, collectively recognize that there are entire institutions, right? And my panelists have mentioned this in terms of policing, criminal justice, prisons, whiteness, that if we don't kind of turn the corner and deconstruct them for what they are, then I think that we will see worsening, I think, polarization and conflict in America. But I don't think it's inevitable. It just requires a lot of painful introspection on all of our parts.
Thank you for that, Sean. The idea is that if there are some bad apples, the system is fine. We just have to deal with these bad apples. It's sort of like saying we can resolve economic inequality by raising the minimum wage. And that's certainly a step in the right direction. That's not going to solve the systemic problems. I appreciate, but we also have the problem of immunity, which is somehow debated of whether police should have immunity. It seems bizarre that we're debating that. And then, of course, we have the blue wall, which that's the culture written into the police. Just back up to a point Heath made. We have a question. Heath, you said, and I know I was a little flip about it, I said the way to get rid of white supremacy is to get rid of white supremacy and give up this idea of whiteness. Being a little flip and vague, I admit. But Heath, we have a question here asking for specifics on, it says, what would we give up is basically to summarize the question. What would we give up as white people?
Well, I mean, that's a question. I mean, that's the question for, I think, individual white people. And I think that I would love to see work being done, like, apart from me and other Black people. I mean, there's economic things. I mean, I think at the forefront that the most difficult thing has to do with feeling discomfort, feeling I was thinking about, one of the questions that we talked about before was about like pedagogy. And I was thinking about, I said before, I teach a course on African American political thought, and as with all semesters, basically, I always have students come up at the end and say that I'm the first Black professor they've had at Temple. And I wondered about, why I would love to see my white colleagues incorporate, African American thought into their courses. Or I wondered if even one of them would teach that course, and then automatically you sort of imagine, well, I can't talk to that, I can't speak to those issues because I'm not Black. And you hear that a lot. I've heard that a lot over the course of my lifetime about, well, I'm supportive, but I can't, I'm not Black, so I can't do that. Well, maybe it means being embarrassed. Maybe it means trying something that you get wrong the first time and you figure it out. I mean, I think, and it goes also to gender, sexuality, women's studies. I mean, I think, these issues are integral to every corner of the university. And so we sort of, partner with different departments and try to do that. But I think at the root of it is this discomfort with change. What would it mean for me to be the only white person in a room? What would it mean for me to live in a different part of the city? What would I lose in terms of my comfort and my sense of economic advantage and my sense of success? I think those are really fundamental moral questions that this country has not dealt with. And it is at the crux of white liberalism. I mean, Martin Luther King talked about this decades ago. It's a huge impediment, I think, to moving forward, because Black people can't do it on our own. And some of those things mean that you're going to have to really dig deep and think about not just the business case for diversity, but the moral case as well.
Yeah, I welcome you all to respond to this thinking about what we do in the classroom. I'm always shocked that students come with this sense of the experience of Black people in this country as being something separate and apart from their own experience. That Black history, let's say, for example, as a historian, is not their history. And when I teach classes where we talk about the Industrial Revolution and the rise of global capital, and they say nothing about Africa. They say nothing about the Atlantic slave trade. They say nothing about slavery in the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean around sugar. And I'm astounded by that, even though it happens every single year. We talk about the rise of the middle class in the United States. They say nothing about Jim Crow and redlining and the origins of the wealth gap. And I'm astounded by that, even though it happens every single year. And there's this notion that, and I think it's sadly become embedded in American culture. And you could speak to this idea of cultural norms, but the idea that even mentioning race is somehow racist, where if I talk about Black people, or identify Black people as somewhat having a peculiar experience, a different experience, that is me being racist. If I point out that someone is Black, that's being racist. Sometimes my students, when they describe someone, they whisper Black. They'll describe the person and then they'll say, because there's this discomfort, Heath, I think you touch upon, in just talking about race in and of itself, let alone racism.
Yeah. I mean, there's this a real fear of being called a racist, thinking about oneself as racist. And I think, this whole discussion about systemic racism is that racism is not an event, it's a system, and we're all caught up in one way or another. And the thing is to, I think, at once learn how to depersonalize that, but also personalize it as far as what you're going to do to bring about some change. But I do think it's sort of this a real defensiveness, and also it has a policy kind of backdrop to it as well. Think about how we used to talk about race-based affirmative action as one of the outcomes of the civil rights movement of the 60s. And then starting very quickly after some of those legislative gains and those programs, the backlash, and then the Supreme Court, over a succession of cases, gutted the concept of race-based affirmative action, so that now we have the language of diversity, and we don't even talk about that anymore. So that diversity, the Supreme Court has said that diversity can be a legitimate educational goal for higher education institutions, but you can't, race can be one of many factors, but you can't have any quotas, you can't have any numerical goals. And I wonder if we don't have those numerical goals, which I think institutions have anyway, we just can't talk about them. then how are we going to figure out what we're doing or evaluate our progress? If it's this amorphous thing, we can never talk about sort of, I mean, that's got a policy foundation that has really sort of muted that conversation, where even to bring it up will we risk a lawsuit? Is this, am I going to be called racist for mentioning it? It's a good example of how just like policy shift had a profound impact on our everyday cultural norms of how we talk about race.
And it's my feeling that we begin in the middle of the conversation for that. We talk about policy and affirmative action. We always speak of giving things to African Americans, but we erase the history of having taken away things beyond labor, but intellectual labor as well, and social mobility as well. For most of the history of this country, there's this idea that we're constantly giving Black people things, but we don't talk about the things that this country has taken away. Celeste, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I wanted to just add to this conversation about the role of the academic in this current moment. And there's two kind of ways that I have been thinking about it. The first way is that I think that we as experts in our disciplines have an opportunity as well as an obligation to really sit with the demands that are being put forward in this movement. These demands for police abolition, for defunding and dismantling police, for example, right, have been long kind of pushed aside as these kind of utopian ideals. But in my research, for example, I have found kind of an everyday life of abolition, as I like to call it, where people, particularly in Black communities where I do my research, have never called the police, and they have these really informal kind of grassroots infrastructures of care and safety that they use to both prevent violence as well as to respond to incidences of violence as they come up. Then there are also these really formalized, institutionalized systems that we can turn to and hold up in our research as evidence for the types of things that people are arguing for. And one of the examples that comes to mind, and from just my own, background knowledge, and that I've seen come up a lot in recent conversations, is a formal example from Eugene, Oregon, that the city has a kind of a program called Cahoots, which is comprised of these non-armed emergency response teams. So there are EMTs, there are mental health emergency responders who people can directly call when they see issues or they're experiencing issues. And also, this system is funded by the police, and calls can actually be transferred over to this Cahoots team when people call 911. And so operators can determine whether or not police intervention is necessary. And I think it's about 20% of 911 calls that are transferred over to Cahoots, and that's not even counting the calls that directly go to that team. And so I think as academics, we have a responsibility to look to these existing models of the things that people who are organizing on the ground are calling for. We have the ability, the resources to define that evidence, to highlight existing evidence that supports radical transformation. And then beyond our research, I think in terms of abolition, I think we can even think about service. As academics, that's, teaching, research, and service. We're always thinking about these things. And I think specifically when it comes to abolition, we as educators have a responsibility to really think about how we might transform education as we hopefully move towards this world where there are no police. Often education is at the center of discussions as a real public safety net that we need to develop further investments in as we divest from policing. But as we know from research, around the school to prison pipeline, and as we can see in demands, even in Philadelphia, Temple students right now are demanding that the university cut its ties with the Philadelphia Police Department and the Philadelphia Police Foundation. There's also the Philadelphia Student Union, who's arguing for the Philadelphia School District to end its legal agreement with the Philadelphia Police Department and to replace school police officers with non-armed community members who are trained in de-escalation and restorative justice. And so youth are really at the helm of a lot of these conversations and visions and organizing around police abolition. And I think as educators, we have a responsibility to lift up their voices, to support them in this organizing and be a part of it so that, you know, as we divest from police and invest in education, the schools are a site of safety rather than part and parcel of state violence.
Very good. Now we have had a very generative conversation. Sadly, perhaps this is part one. We're moving toward our final minutes. Heath and Celeste have touched on next steps, so to speak, in moving toward the fall semester at Temple and beyond, secondary and tertiary institutions. What are we doing differently? How are we going to ensure that we are part of this transformative change or transformation that is necessary toward building an equitable society in the United States of America and globally? Heath touched upon in terms of syllabi and pedagogy. What are some significant changes that must take place? How, maybe you've been doing them already, but what must our syllabi, what must our class conversations, and Celeste, you pointed to service, what must these look like as university professors at a Research One university, but also speaking to high school professors and college instructors? What must we do as educators to ensure that we are part of the transformation? This is my final question, so you have to jump at it.
I can start, Ben, if that's okay. I have just one quick response, which is that I think we all have to use the classroom strategies that work for our courses and topics the best. But I think universally, it's our incumbent obligation to invoke students and those around us into recognizing their privilege, if that's applicable, in moments of discomfort. And we should not be afraid to generate moments of discomfort, because it's in those margins that I think real recognitions of inequalities and injustices are gained. I think that tiptoeing around issues is kind of just kicks the bucket down the road. I think that by posing the most critical, open-ended questions that kind of just make reality seem absurd, particularly for people who've never had to face racial injustice, that may be a very modest first step towards nudging them to a much bigger stage of dialogue. Questions I found work with some of my former students I've encountered publicly or just online include, for instance, why does the Philadelphia Police Department have mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles from the US military that were designed to fight al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? Why is that a tool of policing in North Philadelphia, right? Why is it that when there's a crime committed in your neighborhood, if you're white, the racial identity of the perpetrator, if it's a violent crime, can be a social fact? If you're a person of color, it's a life-changing fact, because if that person shares the same racial phenotype as you now have to change your life routine so you don't get mistaken for that person, which is something that most white people never have to experience. The notion that their race is not part of their life routine. I think that just forcing people to enter these moments of disjuncture and recognizing in these discomfort that there is something there. Either all of us are insane or there's something there, which is more likely.
Heath?
I would also just jump in and add a couple things there. I mean, I think two things. One, you kind of talked to this, Ben, before, but I think, what would it mean for our colleagues and for all of us as faculty to think about the ways that race and gender, these identities and sexuality are embedded in the subjects that they teach. So thinking about one of the problems that we have in academia is the hierarchical structure that we started out with, and the reforms that we've made have sort of kept that in place. And so at Temple, as in a lot of places, we have a general education program where we sort of have a course on diversity, where students have to take that along the way. And for those of us who have taught that, sometimes you have, a lot of recalcitrance in the classroom. part of that, I think, is by sort of setting it apart, that this is something that you have to do, and you know, you got to kind of go and take this course over here, rather than integrating that history and those you know, thinking about who wrote the readings for your syllabi, you know. I mean, I think like this, there's a lot that we as individuals can do within the existing structure, but also questioning as we go through this big tumultuous time with the pandemic. If we've learned anything from it, is that big complex organizations like Temple can respond and make drastic changes on a dime, basically, and we're going to see a lot of changes in academia as we go forward. Why not take this opportunity to rethink some of those things that have sort of been accepted as the way that we do things?
I think, if anything, this conversation in this moment speaks to the importance of the liberal arts for addressing these issues, synthesizing them for the public, and prescribing further action to transform society. I think the liberal arts, of course, has been marginalized, seen as something that's a kind of a luxury. But I think this moment speaks to how very, very important the liberal arts is, liberal arts majors, liberal arts institutions, and liberal arts instructors. So I thank you for the conversation. At this moment, we're going to bring back Judith Levine, who is the director of Temple University's Policy Lab, to round out our conversation.
Thank you, Ben. Kim Williams, the director of CHAT, and I are grateful to you all for holding this incredibly important conversation. We've been getting kind of live messages as it's been going on of people just absolutely thrilled with the conversation and how deep and meaningful it was. So thank you all so very much. You all signed on to doing this within hours of being asked, and we're so appreciative that you did. Thank you, Ben Talton, for moderating the panel with such mastery, and thank you, Heath Davis, and Jima Alagre, Celeste Winston, and Sean Yum for bringing your wealth of experience to illuminate where we've been, where we are, and where we might be going. Your comments, as Ben just said, I just want to second your evaluation of the liberal arts. I do think that moments like these make it very clear what the value of the liberal arts is, and how they bring an understanding of racism and injustice and ways to combat these immoral forces. Kim and I also want to thank all of you who joined for today's conversation. There certainly wouldn't be a webinar without you. We are honored to say that 854 people registered for the event. We thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. There were a lot of good questions, but time is limited. We hope that in future conversations, you will bring up these questions again. I just want to note that Ajima mentioned several articles, which are quite easy for people in academic systems to get access to. But if you don't have access to a university library system, Kim Williams is gathering these articles, and she is able to email them to you. So please email her at chat, C-H-A-T, at temple.edu. We want to bring your attention again to the event that Kim mentioned in the introduction, that our colleagues in the Department of Africology and African American Studies are hosting on June 30th from 1 to 4 p.m. The virtual seminar will be moderated by Department Chair Dr. Molefi Asante, and will feature Africology and African American Studies faculty members and distinguished scholars from many other universities. The link to the event can be found on the department webpage Events tab, and that link will bring you to where you can register for the event. In September, the Center for Sustainable Communities will also be hosting an event addressing racism. Stay tuned for details to come. We want to thank, Kim and I want to thank our College of Liberal Arts Dean and Associate Deans for their support of our centers and of this event. Michelle Bonilla and Colin Hammer were our partners in organizing today's webinar. We also want to thank all of our wonderful colleagues in the College of Liberal Arts and at CHAT and at PPL, who helped us make the webinar possible. As we were making final preparations for the webinar just last night, we learned that Temple University will be officially recognizing the Juneteenth holiday tomorrow by closing for the celebration. We wish you all a meaningful day. May this time bring the differences that are deeply needed. Thank you for joining us, and thank you once again, Ben and all of the panelists. It was an incredible conversation. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.